morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Minister, colleagues, friends. Thank you for coming to our event. My name is Laetitia de Mare, and I'm the Director of Climate Analytics Office here in New York. And I'm also leading the work of our organization on implementation. We are very happy to welcome you to the first of our two events during this Climate Week 2019. We will provide you more detail about the second event that will be held right here, same time tomorrow. I see some familiar faces in the room, but for those of you who don't know climate analytics, just a few words to introduce ourselves. We are a non-profit climate science and policy institute. We've been established in 2008. Our headquarters are in Berlin, but we have also offices here in New York, in Perth, in Australia, and in Lomé, Togo. We have also associates in different regions, including in Asia, particularly in Nepal and Bhutan, in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, and some of them are in the room, so please make the most out of them. Our multidisciplinary team brings together experts from very different backgrounds and different perspectives. Over the years, our activities have grown and diversified, and they include synthesizing and advancing science and knowledge in the areas of climate impacts, climate policy, implementation, and climate finance. We provide scientific and technical support to the most vulnerable countries in the international negotiations, which are the least developed countries, the small island developing states. So you can imagine our team's been very busy in the lead up to the summit last week and beginning of this week. We also undertake extensive analysis in the context of the 1.5 limit of the Paris Agreement, including the linkages with the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We track and analyze the effectiveness of national climate policies, measures, and pledges against the Paris Agreement objective with the Climate Action Tracker, which is one of our flagship projects. And we also work with and in developing countries on implementing their nationally determined contribution, those NDCs, and their national adaptation plans, into country-owned transformational actions and impactful projects at the national and also regional levels. But back to today's event. Our discussions today will be moderated by Mr. Richard Black. Hi, Richard. Richard is the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, which promotes engagement with energy and climate change issues in the UK. For many years, Mr. Black worked as a science and environment correspondent for the BBC. You might have crossed paths with Richard in the corridors of the UNFCCC meetings, Rio +20, or over UN summits. He then went on to become the director of communications for the Global Ocean Commission. And some shameless advertising here. He recently published a book, on climate denial titled "Deny the Rise and Fall of Climate Contrarianism." So, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy this event and please engage. And now over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Laetitia. A commission will be on its way for every copy of Denied that's bought as a result of this event. So thank you. So thanks to CA for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to CA, frankly, for all the work that you do. I think Laetitia gave you a rundown of what CA does, but the impact is much greater than that. The sort of pioneering work, for example, on the different sort of impacts between 1.5 and 2 Celsius kind of led the scientific community in that. So I think in a sense we all owe CA a group of thanks. So welcome not only to you, all of you in the hall, but also welcome to everyone who's watching on live stream around the world. Last night I went to a memorial dinner for Maurice Strong, the guy who sort of started all of this, the architect of the first ever UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm back in 1972, and the leading light of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And during the evening, they played part of an interview that Maurice Strong gave in 1972, that's nearly 50 years ago. And he foresaw everything that we see around us today. Not in detail, of course, but in the principle, the environmental pressures that are impacting human societies and nature impacting sustainable development. not only did Maurice envisage the sort of scientific picture that we see around us, but he was also instrumental in setting up some of the institutions that we see around us, the United Nations Environment Programme, for example. And of course, without Rio, we wouldn't have a United Nations Climate Change Treaty or a United Nations Biodiversity Treaty. And it's very fitting for me to have been there and then to be here, because this is a crunch time, it seems to me. You know, we've heard it many times before, you know, that basically we need to solve the problem now. But I think it's actually true this time. The science shows that there's a very, very, very small window now for getting things sorted out. And today, this morning, we're going to hear about some of the implications of that. Because when the IPCC tells us, for example, that emissions need to halve by 2030 and go to net zero by 2050, that's a very big picture. And it doesn't say what that means for individual countries or individual sectors. It doesn't really give policymakers that sort of detailed information on what they actually should be doing in order to try to hit the targets that they've signed up to. So this morning we're going to be hearing from climate analytics experts on basically where we are now with current pledges under the UN framework and plans, and where they're leading to, what sort of future they're leading us to. We're going to hear about the case for upgrading those nationally determined contributions and the kind of long-term plans that countries have. And we're going to look at what upgrading actually means at the detailed level of countries and sectors. After the presentations, we're going to have a bit of discussion, and we'll have reflections from representatives from 2 or 3 governments. I say 3 because the third may be on his way and may not be, depending on events outside. Now, I'm going to hand over now to the 2 presenters of this. So we're hoping that Bill Hare, CEO of Climate Analytics, would be here to open the presentations, but Bill is actually briefing leaders of Pacific Island states this morning. So he's detained, sends his apologies, but we will hear from Bill on the panel later on. In the meantime, I'd like to hand over, without any further ado, to Paula Yanguas-Parra, who's the lead of decarbonisation strategies at Climate Analytics, and Claire Stockwell, senior climate policy analyst responsible for CA's work on the climate action tracker. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see a full room, because that means you're all interested in what we have to say. And I hope we can live up to that expectation. And please feel free to take some of the seats at the front if you're sitting in the back. Yeah, so let's get this started. Thank you for the introduction, Richard. That was very, very good. So this is basically what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the importance and the meaning of the 1.5 degrees target and the Paris Agreement. Then we're going to see where are we now, the state of play at the moment, and finally, how can we move towards improving our NDCs and improving climate action and ambition. So to start with, why are we talking about 1.5? What's the importance and what is the meaning of this target? So yeah, for those of you who have not read in detail the Paris Agreement, the long-term temperature target, or the goal of the Paris Agreement, is established in Article 2, and it is to limit average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. So this is very important, because before Paris, we only had a global limit or target of below 2 degrees. And the Paris Agreement moves substantially beyond that, saying we need to, actually, that is not safe enough, because we need to reduce significantly the risk and impacts of climate change. That would only be achieved to holding warming well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to 1.5. And because at the moment, the science on 1.5 was not ready yet, the IPCC was commissioned to write a whole report about what does this mean? What does 1.5 mean? How can we get to limit global warming towards 1.5? And that's what they did in their report released in 2018. Here we see the summary for policymakers. You probably have not read, but it's a very comprehensive report. And we'll focus a little bit on unpacking some of those key messages from that report to show you what it means, this 1.5 degrees limit. So something that's very important to understand is that there are thousands of pathways that could, in the end, lead you to 1.5 degrees, but not all of them are Paris Agreement compatible. And here are some characteristics that the IPCC has established to what does it mean to be a Paris Agreement compatible. So one of them, which is very important, is that the 1.5 is not overshoot by a large margin during the century. So it's So Paris Agreement pathway would only be one with none or very limited overshoot of that temperature target and then returning to 1.5. But also, it has established some sustainability limits. So we will need some negative emissions, but there are some sustainability limits in our planet to what is a sustainable level of negative emissions that we can afford. And that will be actually in line with sustainable development. So we'll show you what that means more concretely, but this is important to remember, that it has been established. This is the latest available science, and this is what should guide where we need to go. So now why this is important, you saw Article 2, reducing significantly the risks and impacts of climate change. So as Richard said, we have produced a lot of scientific work in what are the avoided impacts, what are the avoided risks between 1.5 and 2 degrees. What does this matter? As you can see, for many, many, many important impacts, such as extreme events, sea level rise, coral reefs, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is very large. It's actually extremely large if you compare those two, and can make a huge impact. So limiting warming to 1.5 can reduce substantially the risks and impacts of climate change. Here you see it in another way. This is not in only some countries. It's actually all around the globe. As you can see, that's the probability of reduced economic damage. So it's basically almost 100% probability reduction of huge economic damages all over the globe, and lots of reduced damages if you keep warming to 1.5 instead of 2 degrees. So I just want you to remember this as we go in the presentation, because now we'll show you how we get to 1.5. And yeah, this is a recent paper we have written where we will show you that's actually a measure of economic damage that could be avoided if you were to increase the ambition of current NDCs and of current efforts and limit it to 1.5 degrees. So it's quite substantial. You have different regions there, but that's just to say that it's not only impacts on ecosystems, but it's also impacts on the economy that we're talking about. And with that, Bill, do you want to take over from here, or should I continue? Okay. So with that, we'll show you how there are, as I said, hundreds of pathways, but this is a typical 1.5 degrees pathway. This is what needs to happen with emissions, basically. So there are very, very important characteristics of those pathways. The line I'll be showing are total net greenhouse gases. You'll see a picture afterwards. They'll show you what happens at the sector level, but this is total net greenhouse gas emissions. Very, very important. They need to peak in 2020. So all the pathways basically tell us this, which is next year. That's the latest where we can peak. Around 2020, we need to peak emissions, and then after that, they need to be reduced quite rapidly. They need to be decreased to around 45 levels below 2010 already by 2030. So it's quite rapid, and then getting to zero or net zero around in the second half of the century, roughly 2070. This is total greenhouse gases. If you look at only CO2, so carbon neutrality, that needs to happen before. This is total greenhouse gas reductions. And then you have some degree of negative emissions, but as I say, there are some sustainability criteria, so there's no huge negative emissions. There's some degree of negative emissions. Afterwards, this is how you will see the full picture with some different sectors. So There are some sectors where you cannot get to zero emissions, for instance, some activities in agriculture that you cannot completely get to zero. That has to be compensated by some degree of negative emissions, but again, it has to be limited. It cannot be beyond the sustainability limits. It's established by the IPCC. And yeah, now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Claire to show us where are we in comparison to these benchmarks.
Good morning, everyone. As Leticia said at the, that's the wrong button. Leticia said this morning, the Climate Action Tracker is one of Climate Analytics' flagship products, which we do in partnership with the New Climate Institute. And what the tracker does is each year, traditionally, we've taken all of the latest data in terms of the historical emissions that we have from countries, as well as their projections going forward of where they think their emissions will go, and we run that through a climate model to get an estimate of where do we think temperature is going to be at the end of this century. And so we've done that, especially normally we would do that for the COP, but this year, because of the importance of the SG Summit, we wanted to do an updated assessment now to really give you a sense of what is the baseline, where we are today, and then that could be measured against, in the next 14 months, can we see movement from countries in terms of the strengthened NDCs that we need to see. So here on this slide, we have the latest results that we released last week, which show you in terms of the NDCs that countries have put forward, we're close to a doubling of what we've committed to under Paris. So clearly we're not on track in that regard. And even more sobering is if we look at where we are in terms of real world action and current policy projections, you're up there at around the 3.2 degrees Celsius, so more than doubling by the end of this century. And just to put a finer note on that in terms of timing, what does that mean when we would potentially exceed 1.5 degrees? If we take the current policy, so the real world action of where we are, we could hit 1.5 degrees of warming as early as 2035. So, you know, almost right around the corner. We could hit 2 degrees by 2053, and then of course the 3.2 by the end of the century. So the case couldn't be stronger for why we need to be strengthening our ambition here. If we move on to that, that's the sort of long-term, the warming of where we're going to get to at the end of the century. But as Paula was mentioning in her presentation, it's not just that end goal that we need to get to net zero, it's of course the path that we take to get there. And so here, this shows you where we are in terms of the emissions gap if we wanted to be on a trajectory that was 1.5 degrees compatible. And the gap, as you can see, for 1.5 is quite significant here at 27 to 30 gigatons. So we've definitely got our work cut out for us. Unfortunately, the global picture is not a positive one. We've got CO2 emissions are on the rise. Coal is making a comeback, natural gas is booming, and renewables are not where we need to be. It was a bit disappointing on Monday. We were expecting a lot more ambitious actions from countries, not just this week committing that we will increase our NDCs. So clearly the next 14 months are critical to change this picture so that hopefully the next time you come to a presentation of ours, we have a little bit more positive story to share with you. In terms of countries' individual emissions, what we do within the tracker is we look at, we take all of the equity literature that's available and we come up with what would be a country's fair share range to get to 1.5 degrees, and then we compare that to what is the current commitment that they've taken on and rank countries. And so what these different temperature levels tell you is that if a country were to take a similar level of ambition, where would that get us to warming? So I'm Canadian, so I will pick on the Canadians and say if everyone took the same level of ambition as Canada, we would get to 3 degrees of warming. So I think what hopefully this slide can visually display to you is many countries are not on track, and again, the next 14 months will be critical to changing this picture. This is just a sort of summary of what I've been going through in terms of that the level of action currently really is insufficient. We need to ramp up action. That's both in the NDCs that we expect for next year, as well as those long-term strategies. because we're, at the moment, we have the sort of critical window to get to that peaking that Paula outlined in 2020, as well as, and that to achieve that, it's not just a question of increasing NDC ambition, but also we need to follow through on the policy implementation on the ground. So I think we will now shift to what do we need to see in terms of actual actions, and I will hand the floor back to Paula in our continuing tank team efforts. Yeah. Sorry. Let's see where we are.
Okay. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Okay. Is this any better? Okay. So thank you for that, Claire. So you have made the case why we need to ramp up ambition and action. And we'll show you a little bit and some ideas we have of how you can do that. So first of all, it does not come as a surprise. So the Paris Agreement, it's really so remarkable, so important, because basically every country on earth signed up to it and ratify it. But that came at expense, and that was actually many of the architects of that are around the room, so you know more about that, is that everyone will come up to the table with whatever they thought they could deliver, right? So it's a bottom-up approach, and the price of that is that, of course, nobody knew how many people are going to how many countries are going to commit to this, what are they going to bring to the table. So it will come out of that first round of NDCs, or voluntary commitments, will likely be not the most ambitious, because you're waiting to see what is happening, how is this agreement going. So that was already, I think, foreseen by many of the architects of the Paris infrastructure, and that's why they created inside of the agreement ambition ramp-up mechanism. So how it is, I tried to explain quickly here with this timeline. It is established that every 5 years there will be a cycle of updating of NDCs, and then in each update you should pursue the highest ambition possible, taking into account whatever that has changed in those 5 years, and taking also into account where collective action is taken. So every time you have a round of NDCs, you collect it and you see where together, all of us, the collective action is taking us in terms of temperature. Claire already showed that, so we're not doing very well yet. And then taking into account that, we see, okay, how much do we have to upgrade in the next round to go a bit closer and closer to where we need to be. So that's more or less how it is. And the first, because the Paris Agreement was in 2015, the first update round, it's now 2020. So basically, within the next year, we would need to see countries coming forward with more ambitious targets. And that was part of the call of the SG Antonio Guterres to have to have a summit on climate ambition. It's also what Chile in its presidency for Santiago is calling. It's calling the Cup of Ambition, because now is where we really need to see how this ambition mechanism comes to play and how more ambitious countries get with time. So big expectations for 2020, and then we'll see how that collective action is bringing us closer in 2023 in the global stocktake, and then you will have successive rounds of NDCs. So for the time being, most countries have put forward targets for 2030. There's also a process of inviting countries to submit long-term strategies. So what we would also need to see within 2020 is how countries align those short-term targets for 2030, 2025, 2030, to those long-term strategies where they need to be in the next few decades. So that's it. Now we started looking, okay, what type of ambition levels we could see. And here are a few scenarios. So I'll explain first the graph so that you can understand what we did. There are some dotted lines and there are some solid lines. The dotted lines are scenarios where a big amount of countries, so there are 32 countries, including the largest emitters, they come forward with more ambitious NDCs, but the others don't. The others continue on the same ambition pathway. That's where you get. So roughly those 32 countries account for 80% of global emissions. And then the solid line, which is the one we want to focus on, are scenarios where everyone, no matter how big their share of global emissions is now, everyone is coming with with more ambitious NDCs. That's where we get. So you see there are actual noticeable differences between scenarios where only the large majority move, as opposed where everyone is moving. But then you'll see this is something that we might be expecting, looking at some examples of how countries have, for instance, submitted NDCs that have conditional and unconditional pledges. So when you look at the difference between those conditional and unconditional pledges, you see differences around 10 and 20%. So that's a minimal is 10%, incremental is 20%. Between 10 and 20% increase in the emissions pledges. So to give you some examples, Indonesia has a conditional target that's 10% lower than its unconditional one. Peru 10%, Kazakhstan 13%, Mexico 18%, and so on and so forth. So if countries were to say, okay, now we just, because a lot of those conditions were, okay, provided that there is climate finance or provided that there is a global agreement, so provided that those conditions are met, we go to our conditional pledges. This will be the type of ambition that roughly that you will be seeing. Unfortunately, that will not bring us anywhere close to where we need to be. That will lead to a warming of over 2 degrees, depending on if everyone moves or not. It would be roughly 2.4 or 2.6 degrees, so it's still not. And based on the outcomes that we saw from the summit, where everyone was kind of making announcements that are roughly in line with what they're already doing, this could be a scenario we will be seeing, so that's a danger. This is not the type of ambition that we will need to be seeing, and we should not celebrate this type of ambition. Why should we advocate for? What should we look for? That's also another question we ask ourselves. So how much would it take us to kind of cross the line below 2 degrees? And for that, we see that an increase of at least 35% below the current levels implied by NDCs will be needed in the short term. And maybe to explain something very important that you might not notice here, as you can see, at higher levels of ambitions, the difference between only a few countries moving and everyone moving becomes bigger and bigger. So why is this? This is because each of the countries, they are basically holding back the tipping points that you need to have in terms of technologies adoption, in terms of transformational points. So the more ambitious pledges you get in the short term, the more lock-ins you avoid, because a lot of these decisions that are taken in the short term have implications decades afterwards. So the more lock-ins you avoid, the deeper you can go in terms of emissions reductions, and the more people or the more countries contribute to this, the larger the economies of scale and market mechanisms and technical mechanisms that activate to get to very substantial reductions in the second half of the century. So that's why you see a bigger difference there. And finally, what would it take to get to 1.5? This is also something that we try, and it's very clear. Basically, a 50% improvement. That means basically halving the emissions level implied by current NDCs. That, if continued over time, that will put you very much in a pathway that will bring us to 1.5 degrees. This is, so if you're advocating for any NDC updates, this is the level of ambition that you should be striving for. And something interesting that you will see, so if we get transformational, but we don't get everyone on board, you're still very much close to 2 degrees. So even if you get transformational, you need to get transformational from everyone, and that resonates a lot with a lot of interventions that have been given by small countries that have very, very small shares of global emissions, but that are already committing to transform completely their energy systems and transform completely their economies. No matter how small they're leading by example, and this is precisely what you need to get to those levels of reductions. So just to give you some examples how this actually translates into a specific NDC, I'm going to mention a couple of proposals that have been given by national organizations to specific countries on how they can improve the NDC. So the European Union, for instance, has a current NDC of reducing emissions 40% below 1990 levels. And there has been a discussion in the European Parliament that at the moment it's not clear yet because some member states don't agree with this, of an updated NDC of 55% below 1990 levels. So that translates to our system into a 55%, into a 25% improvement. On the other hand, the Climate Action Network, the NGOs, have been advocating for a 65% below 90 levels. That brings us to a 42% improvement. So that brings us to the transformational area, to the actual significant space of things, meaning that a lot of what is being discussed at the moment is not really significant or transformation, still on the incremental side of things. And yeah, if you remember the slide that Claire shared, where you have this huge emissions gap in 2030, this is the metric for each of our scenarios. So you will go from roughly 28 gigatons that we are at to slowly start closing that emissions gap to 23, 17, 10, and finally closing entirely that emissions gap. That's what each of our scenarios shows. And here is a metric that you might find a little bit easier to understand, which is what will be the reduction compared to 2010 levels of each of those scenarios. Yeah, so that's just a short summary of what I said, what is important to come up with updated NDCs, but they and long-term strategies, but they cannot stay in the incremental side of things. They have to, if we're talking about real ambition, they have to go to the very much transformational ambition area, which in our scenarios you see it's something at least 35% and heading towards 50% reduction, so doubling of the ambition. But again, this is very much talking about the collective ambition that we all need to reach. It will look very different for specific sectors and specific countries, so we'll go a little bit in detail into that. And for that, I just have this slide because I cannot overemphasize enough. We don't have enough time to walk you through what each of the sectors should be doing, but this is just so you remember, and it's all in the IPCC, that action in all sectors is needed. We were surprised to see with our team that there are 120 events in this New York Climate Week related to natural solutions, as opposed to only 25 or 26 about energy transition. So that's just to remember that we need transformational action in all sectors, and natural solutions are around this area. They're already included in this 1.5 pilot. So you already have transformational ambition there, but you also need it in all sectors. That's just to overemphasize this point, and I will just go into one sector that is very important for the transformational ambition that we need, which is the electricity sector. Yeah, so when I was thinking about this is like, if you want to lose weight and you really want to do it, there are a number of things you need to exercise, you need to reduce your carbs consumption, you need to do a lot of changes. So I'm gonna focus on only one that's like very important, but that doesn't mean you will get there if you don't do the others. And that is the electricity sector. And for that, this is the equivalent, if you're losing weight, of the liter of Coca-Cola you're drinking every day. You need to stop that very quickly if you really want to get somewhere. So that's coal. That's coal for power production, for power generation. And these are results from a report that is out of the oven. We just published it on Monday. That's basically unpacking what the IPCC pathways say, but for this very specific sector, which is coal and power generation. And I mean, you can see it very, very clearly. Basically, all the pathways. This is a very small uncertainty range. That's an interquartile range. So it's a very small uncertainty around it. Every single pathway basically agrees on this. Emissions have to peak by 2020, then be quickly reduced by 2030, already 80% below 2010 levels, and then be completely phased out at the latest in 2040. There will be some differences on the regions because they have different starting points. So you will see that some of them will need to move a lot faster. The OECD and the European Union in particular will need to move a lot faster and phase out roughly in 2030, with some countries and regions phasing out a bit later, such as Asian countries will which are getting closer to the 2040 date. So yeah, this is just to overemphasize, this is probably the single most important step that you need to do if you want to get into transformational ambition. However, again, measuring this with the reality and a reality check, we're still very far away from that. So all the blue and gray areas that you see in that picture are planned power plants. So there are still a number of countries, a large number of countries that are still either constructing or planning to expand new coal power plants. So basically, again, with the Coca-Cola, you're not only drinking a liter, but you're adding 100 milliliters or so every day to your consumption, which is definitely not the right way to go. And I think that's why the Secretary General Guterres was so clear about calling for stopping of all new coal power plants. This is very, very, very important. However, as you can see, it's not enough. It's not enough. Even if we were to stop building coal power plants today, you will still have, because they have long operating lifetimes, around 40 years or so, you will still have a lot of power plants that will need to be retired much earlier than their technical lifetime. If you are to really reduce emissions and decarbonize the electricity sector at the rate that is needed, and if you don't decarbonize your electricity sector, you're having a very hard time to go transformational, because a lot of the strategies for the other sectors, such as buildings and transport and industry, relate to electrifying those sectors. So you need to have a clean electricity supply in the first place. And the good news, if anything, really good news, is that almost everywhere in the world, in a large number of geographies, we see that the renewable energy prices, these are recent projects in auctions, but those are the full range. I don't know if you can see it in this slide, but the fossil fuel range is somewhere from here to here. So basically, they're already cheaper. Already today, 2019, they're already cheaper than building new coal power plants. And the good news is also that this cost is ever decreasing. It's been decreasing since 2015 quite substantially, but the bigger you get, the more economies of scale. So this price is projected to get much lower, which basically means any fossil fuel power plant that you build, you will have to subsidize heavily to run and compete against renewables in the very short term. So that's a very good sign, and that's basically to show the huge potential that we have in the electricity sector to ramp up ambition, not incrementally, but transformationally. And we looked at one region that, because of its scale and because of the situation where it is now, basically can go both ways. Can go in a way that is transformational or no. That's in Southeast Asia. So there's a whole report with different country profiles, but I'll quickly just give you some highlights of that. And that is, let's look at electricity, because that's what I was talking about. So this is a region where energy demand is growing very fast, where economic growth and basically just development is making energy demand increase quite fast. So as you can see, in any scenario, this is even the International Energy Agency scenario, all that demand increase is met by renewable energies. And fossil fuels, they get out of the system quite quickly. Coal, as you saw already, by 2040 roughly, and gas around 2050. So a lot of this demand is met by renewables, but at the same time, you're also decarbonizing what is actually existing there. However, and you can see it here, a lot of these countries, they're planning to double or triple or even more, in cases like Bangladesh, their coal fleet at the moment. They're planning to go 2 or 3 times higher on coal, so meeting a lot of this new energy demand that is coming through coal, which is basically getting in a lock-in for 30 or 40 years in a very carbon-intensive pathway. So it's very, very urgent for those countries to stop that and to reverse that trend and go for renewable energies, basically, to meet their energy demand. But even if you do that, again, look at India, there's still a large number of coal power plants operating that are basically outcompeted by renewables in the next 10 years or so because of different economic reasons. So you also need to retire them before their lifetime. And it's a quite substantial part of it if you look at this. So that's the challenge, and that's how transformational action looks, at least for coal. This is a very important caveat. You saw 2 slides before that there is some gas here, sort of a bridge fuel to integrate higher shares of renewables. We've heard that, but however, the image I was showing was from the IEA. And as you can see, this is the IEA, the dotted line. These are the IPCC pathways median. So this is just to show that the IEA is some sort of an outlier in gas. It has a lot more. And unfortunately, a lot of the companies, private companies, take the IEA as the reference of where business is going, where demand is going, where the world is going and needs to go. But we find it to be an outlier, specifically for gas, is quite high. So just a caveat that while you get rid of coal, you need to replace it by renewable energy, not really by other fossil fuels that also continue locking for many decades. And just to add some positive stories around it, if countries decide to go for this transformational pathway, they would not only contribute a lot to climate change, but they have a large number of co-benefits. So we look at this in the report. I invite you to read it, but basically you have massive air pollution reduction with huge health co-benefits everywhere, really. Affordable and reliable electricity for a lot of people that at the moment don't have it, or it's not reliable, don't have enough of it. Energy independency for many countries that will have to rely on imports of fossil fuels to get their energy system running. Huge amount of job creation to basically create this transformation in the system and sustain it and operate it, and a lot of economic growth. So there are many, many good reasons to go transformational. And now we're going to go into a bit more detail. How can that look in terms of NDCs? And hand it over to Claire again.
Again, everyone. So yes, as Paula's been talking about so far is the analysis that we've done at the sort of global level in terms of where to collectively NDCs need to go, and then also at the sectoral level. So just as we finish off this presentation, we thought we'd look at what does that mean in terms of the country level. And so as part of the tracker, we both track where country action is and where countries are going, but we also want to help in terms of identify areas where governments can increase their mitigation potential. So recently we've launched a series called Scaling Up Climate Action, in which we analyze the potential for a number of countries to strengthen mitigation efforts in key sectors. And so today I thought I would present 2 case studies focusing both on the EU and Argentina. And in both countries we looked at what could you do in electricity supply, residential buildings, and transport, and what would that mean in terms of your emissions. So for the EU, these 3 sectors account for about 60% of the union's emissions. And if you were to decarbonize these 3 sectors alone by 2050, what you would do is have emissions in 2030 compared to 1990 levels, and come to close to about 70% emissions reductions in 2050. So the president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, remarked on Monday that the EU is on track to surpass its target by 45%. But what this analysis shows you is that the EU could and does need to increase that level of ambition to much higher. So in terms of the electricity supply, which is this... Oops.
Can you speak more in the microphone?
Oh, sorry. In terms of electricity supply, if we look at where the EU's current targets are, that equates to about 55% of electricity generation coming from renewable energies in 2030. And if it were to put itself on a 1.5 degree Paris-compatible decarbonization pathway, it would need to increase that to about 60 to 75% in 2030, and then full decarbonization. So to give those numbers a little bit of context, what does that mean? Denmark currently is best in class in terms of growth rates for renewable energies in its electricity supply in the first part of this decade, and the EU as a whole would need to exceed those growth rates by a significant margin. As Paula spoke to at length in terms of the importance, it should come to no surprise that the EU would also need to phase out coal generation by 2030, and that is going to include both the early retirement of current capacity and the cancellation of some planned capacity. So here, it was very positive, I think, on Monday that we saw Greece announce that it's planning to phase out lignite coal by 2028. Unfortunately, however, the German timeline which is phasing out coal by 2038 at the latest, is of course too long and something that we would expect to be strengthened. In the residential sector, so I'm presenting here, these are the 2030 results in terms of what is the potential you could get in terms of emissions reductions. You would need a number of measures, and one of them would be to significantly increase the renovation rates in existing buildings. Here again, Denmark is best in class, but we do need a significant ramping up of rates there. And then finally, on the transportation sector, as Paula was mentioning, of course, we need the complete electrification of this sector, which just reinforces that message for why we need to decarbonize electricity supplies. We would need stronger emission standards in cars, doubling the share of public transportation, as well as selling the last internal combustion engine in 2035. So just to flip that around, that means 100% of new car sales in 2035 would need to be from electric vehicles. At the moment, the EU is on track to reach about 70% in 2040, so they would need to be at much faster growth rates than Norway, which is currently best in class in that category. So if we, as Paula was also mentioning in the colorful slide on co-benefits, we looked at cutting emissions. Obviously isn't just good for the climate, it also has a number of other advantages, and in this report we modeled what it would mean in terms of jobs to decarbonize the electricity sector. And what you can see here is that you've got a significant increase in the numbers of jobs compared to baseline if we were to decarbonize. Now, we did not quantify other possible co-benefits, but there are plenty in terms of reducing energy poverty, cutting air and noise pollution, as well as increasing energy security by decreasing your reliance on imported fossil fuels. If we turn to Argentina, I don't propose to go through the results in detail here, but just to say that we found in this analysis that you could almost fully decarbonize the three sectors by 2050. And I'd rather make three quick points for Argentina, which is that country is blessed with a significant natural endowment in terms of renewable energy, and it also has some strong renewable energy policies and targets in place. So it really is positioned to be a global frontrunner in the energy transition if it strengthens its policy efforts in this area. To do that, though, what it needs to do is shift away from supporting natural gas and building a natural gas extraction and export infrastructure. So you saw earlier, Paula presented the slide on the fact that natural gas has a very limiting bridging function, and so here in Argentina is really one of those countries that sort of needs to take that message to heart and not invest in that type of infrastructure. And then, of course, the final point is that there are significant co-benefits with pursuing a decarbonization pathway. And again, we see compared to baseline, there is a significant increase in the number of jobs in the electricity sector if you were to move on to a Paris-compatible decarbonization pathway. I would like to put just a finer note on these numbers here. I think on what we heard on Monday was a lot of talk about the importance of a just transition and not leaving anyone behind. And what you need to keep in mind here in our baseline scenario is that a lot of the job growth there, the near-term job growth, would come from that natural gas expansion. And so that comes at a significant risk to the Argentinian labor force in that they could create this structural unemployment risk on the medium term should global ambition really lead up to the Secretary General's call and we start to have stringent global climate policy that would also phase out natural gas. That labor force would be at risk and would be ill-prepared for the transition to a zero-carbon society. So if I can just close with a, oh, no, sorry, that should be the map of the world. Unfortunately, I don't know what's happened with the graphic, but at least hopefully those are largely geographically correct in their positioning. But just to say that this is part of a series, so I've sort of briefly run through to you the results from 2 of our countries. We also have analysis for South Africa, which is available on the Climate Action Tracker website. And just to sort of watch this space announcement that we will be releasing the results for Indonesia, Turkey, and Australia between now and the COP, and that those are available both in English and in the national language of the relevant countries. So that was it for my piece. If I could sum up on behalf of both Paula and I, the presentation that we've given you this morning, we really hope what we've conveyed to you is that the current level of action is insufficient to limit warming to 1.5, and what we need is transformational change. While the decarbonization is the end goal, the pathway to get there is equally important. And the next 14 months are really going to be critical for governments to strengthen both their near-term targets, their NDCs, as well as their long-term strategies by the end of 2020. In so doing, we hope that you walk away with the message that, of course, phasing out coal is the single most important step there, but we need action in all sectors and in all countries. The benefits of taking action and accelerating moving towards a zero carbon society go beyond the climate and touch on many aspects of society. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I turn it over to Richard, I think, to introduce our panel.
Thanks so much, Claire and Paola. That was fantastic, wonderful graphics and great information. So, as well as Claire and Paola, you're joining us for the panel as well, are you? For the Q&A?
If you had questions.
Okay, for sure. Okay, what I'd like to do, if I can, also, is ask to come up a couple of guests we've got here from governments, the Honourable Simon Steele.
Sorry, Richard, why don't we go to a quick Q&A?
We can if you like.
For the panel?
Sure, okay.
Yeah, just a few questions.
Okay. So we're joined, as you see, by Bill Hare, who's CEO of Climate Analytics, hot foot from his briefing with some Pacific leaders. Bill, perhaps I could just turn to ask you first. One of the things that I know Climate Analytics and others have been, working on a lot down the years is equity. So when we hear the figures, for example, that NDCs, need to be increased in ambition by about 50%. Is that really across the board, or are we looking at sort of differential increases here between developing countries and developed nations?
Well, clearly we're looking at differential increases across the board. It's a very big generic statement, but every individual country would have to make different levels of commitments. And of course, I think everyone understands that the richer and wealthier countries need to act first. And I just came from a meeting of the Pacific Island heads, and clearly, if you're discussing equity, they're feeling as though their entire existence is under threat by the inaction of the largest emitters. So from their point of view, they have quite a different perspective than the narrow mitigation-only perspective on equity. So I think what all the work that you've just seen shows is that there's great opportunities for all countries to move ahead. And one of the really stark developments that Paola emphasised was the reductions in renewable energy technology costs. And the way in which this changes the framing of an equity discussion in its classical sense is really quite fundamental, because what it means is that for most of my career in this business, you have to have had to justify why a country should take expensive action and who might pay for that if you're a developing country. Now, in many markets in the developing world, it's cheaper to actually build renewable energy than to continue to run existing fossil fuel plants. So that starts to raise all sorts of issues that kind of turn the old equity issue on its head. It doesn't obviate or eliminate the need for financial upscaling because markets are determined often by the most powerful players, the richest. So getting access to capital, de-risking and so on in developing countries to get in the cheap technology is by no means a trivial issue. But I think that equity issue needs to be broadened out to see a much bigger context.
Now, the economics of renewable, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to bring that up. So we've been used for a while to be hearing now that the sort of economics of new renewables are at least competitive with the economics of new coal and gas. But some of the stuff that was presented here suggests that actually, it's now out-competing existing coal and gas. And a follow-up question on that, if that is the case, why aren't we seeing automatically the sort of the reduction in usage of these coal and gas plants?
Well, there's a whole lot of issues that aren't purely economic in the energy sector. I think as anyone who knows, who has any passing observations about that sector, that it's not just about economics, it's also about what people call politely political economy, about the incumbency of public or private corporations or actors in the power sector who would lose in the short run from transitions. It's about enabling workforce to transition away from traditional industries towards the new ones, and that requires government help and intervention. Otherwise, people will suffer, people will be left behind. So it's a combination of issues like that. In really important developing economy markets, you take India, it's said that about half of the National Thermal Power Corporation of India coal plant are more costly to run, existing plant more costly to run than building new solar photovoltaics at utility scale. And you see those kind of anecdotes in many markets. In the United States, nearly every week you need to read a new development where a gas turbine has been outcompeted in a competitive bidding by solar plus battery and so on. This is a story that's growing all over the world, but it doesn't mean that the transition will happen without efforts by government to change the market rules and structures, because it simply won't.
And just one last question before we go to your question. Paola, the dates that you presented, for example, for coal phase out, the sort of OECD 2031, Latin America 2032, if governments had actually started acting faster after the Paris summit, presumably there'd be a little bit more leeway in those numbers. In other words, the urgency presumably has been increased by 4 years of inaction since the Paris summit.
Yes, so thank you for that question, because as I said, that's coming from a report that we just released. So there are some good news that we see. Actually, the Paris Agreement and basically the call from science to stop coal power plants has changed a few things since 2015. And to give you a very clear number, we've seen that the pipeline, so the planned projects for coal, shrunk 75% in the last 5 years. So that's quite significant in terms of what has happened. There's a very clear reaction and policy. There are policy drivers, there are electricity market drivers, and there are financial sector drivers. Like basically, there's a very clear signal that we see. However, it's not fast enough. As you saw, Claire mentioned, there are some countries that came up with some sort of plans, but they're not transformational enough. They're like phasing out by 2038 in the case of Germany, as opposed to 2030. And we have been actually writing dedicated reports. We wrote one for Japan. We wrote one from Germany, basically showing how this can be brought forward and how can you do that on a unit-by-unit level. And yes, I guess inaction is making it harder, of course. That's something also we like to emphasize. We give you phase-out dates, and that's a really good and interesting date that you can have. That's the latest, but what is most important for everything that we always talked about is the pathway, how you get there. You cannot retire 30% of your electricity from 1 year to the other. You need to get into a pathway that really brings you there by having intermediate targets, intermediate steps, and to be checking constantly how you're measuring in reality against those targets and how you can bring them forward, which has happened, by the way, in countries that have set up very clear pathways and saying this is where we're going to phase out coal, just the actors, just the market, and everyone starts basically foreseeing that there's not going to be a business in 10 or 20 years, and they start going faster. And in countries such as Australia, I'm going to look at Bill here, it's basically
It's
the
not Bill's fault,
government
I don't think, but anyway.
where plants want to shut down, utilities want to shut down because they don't see a market for themselves in 10 or 20 years, and the government basically doesn't let them.
It's absolutely incredible, isn't it? Markets and businesses respond to government rules. Who'd have thought?
So,
But Richard, you don't understand. The Australian coal is really clean.
Right. I know. I'm surprised you didn't bring a lump with you, right? Like some of your politicians have done in the past. We're going to take a few questions, but I do want to get on to our panel fairly soon. So, lady here, please, just say who you are and where you're from, please.
Hi, I'm Mary Booth. I'm the director of the Partnership for Policy Integrity. My organization works on biomass energy, and in fact, we just sued the European Union because of the treatment of bioenergy as carbon neutral. Denmark, which you cited as best in class for electricity transformation, actually just had a rather scandalous series of stories in the press about how much of their energy is actually coming from wood pellets that are liquidating forests in other countries and going up smokestacks in Denmark and being counted as zero emissions energy. So my question for you is, how does your modeling treat biogenic emissions? Are you taking into account the loss and liquidation of forest carbon stocks? And are you counting refiring coal plants with wood pellets as shutting down coal plants, as apparently some of the countries who made commitments the other day are? I heard countries saying we're shutting down, we're committing to a coal phase out without mentioning that those plants will still be operating. They're just going to be burning trees.
Okay. Who'd like to take that to place of biomass in this model?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, as I think that Paula emphasised in presenting the filtering of the IPCC pathways, if you like, on 1.5 degrees, we applied the top-down sustainability constraints, including on bioenergy, to take into account a range of estimates of the availability of sustainable biomass, which was done, independently within the IPCC process. So, of course, that's only one constraint. When you start to look also at the national level on what is a sustainable amount of biomass available, it's almost always less than what many claim, and that's important to take that into account. The models, the integrated assessment models do fully account for the carbon flows. Yes, they do, and the more highly resolved ones have feedbacks into the land sector, and that takes into account the carbon flows, and not just the carbon flows, the impacts on methane and nitrous oxide emissions as well. So yes, they are accounting for that. The technology assumptions in the models that we've basically put here, in general, don't substitute bioenergy into coal-fired power stations. They move quickly to modern, clean, renewable systems. What you do see in the present generation of energy system models is at any level of warming, from 3 degrees down to 1.5, a lot of biomass. And it's right to be sceptical about whether that's sustainable, because our judgment is it's generally not. And that needs to be looked at. It's a complicated question, and I don't agree with all of the assumptions implicit in your question either, but it's something that we are concerned about, and we apply all the best available information we can to ensure that we focus on presenting results that are fully sustainable, also in the biodiversity sense.
Okay.
If I may add something to that question, so we have seen this, for instance, in Japan, when you look at coal power plants, and this is the type of policy instruments and policy signals that you send. A lot of countries, they have targets that relate to carbon intensity of their electricity supply. So they want to get to this and that energy intensity, and then you start counting a lot of things like in Japan, co-firing with biomass and a few other things instead of closing down. But the policy signal when you establish a coal phase out is very clear. It's absolutely different to having a target that is sort of decreasing the carbon intensity and the type of measures that you need to have in there, which is basically you don't do co-firing, you close it completely. Are very different. That's why I guess it is important that we have this type of benchmarks. So when you need to do a full, instead of that type of indicators of you see a bit of progress because of energy efficiency, because of co-firing, because of other fuel efficiency, because of ultra super critical coal power plants, you would see an improvement, but that improvement will put you in a lock-in where the last part of the carbon you cannot get rid of because it's the same technology. So
that's probably one to take offline afterwards if you want to catch up, I would have thought. There was a gentleman who's got the microphone.
Yeah. Niti from Malaysia and Regional Coordinator for Climate Action Network, Southeast Asia. And I'd just like to mention that Malaysia is undergoing transformational changes in the electricity sector, which is under the radar and not reported, like including shutting down 4 new coal-fired power plants last year and really ramping up RE supply. And, you know, the reason this has happened is because we've got a brilliant new energy, science, technology, environment and climate change minister, a 35-year-old lady who's a petroleum engineer who's got some civil society background, which her first announcement when she became minister was that she's going to shut down 4 coal plants. So maybe we should focus our energy on making sure that we get the right people positioned into the, elected or, right people appointed as energy ministers in our respective countries. It's just because of the person.
You make it sound so simple.
Yeah, it is. Point number 2, and I shared it with Bill when we met, and she's just brilliant. We were trying to get her here. Unfortunately, she couldn't come here. But regarding just a quick point on Southeast Asia, to add on to why is coal still so popular, one is that renewable energies do not enjoy a level playing field. They are they are disadvantaged compared to fossil fuel, especially coal. So the point is to look at, and also there's a lot of finance coming in to build these plants, especially from Japan, China, and Korea, a lot of public sector finance. So maybe our focus also should be on shifting those financial flows, embarrassing governments which are providing the finance, in particular Japan, and maybe that may be the strategy to adopt to make the shift away from coal.
Just a very quick response to that. Perhaps we'll want to take one more question if I can. Bill, do you want to respond to that quickly?
Well, I must say it was one of the few very positive messages I heard at the recent Bangkok Climate Week, Niti, where you told us all what the Malaysian government is up to on coal. I think it's a symbol of what can be achieved if you get a minister and officials aligned with that minister can actually turn a whole system around relatively quickly. So it's an inspiration, that story, I think.
Great. I want to take one more question from here before we move on to our panel. So, gentleman here with a hand up.
Yeah, Maher Chabo, I chair the Board of REAP, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, and I work for GE. Just the question is, in your model, did you calculate the cost of the transition and what's the impact on the GDP? We know that if, for example, we go more into EVs, so you would ask the people then to change their cars, that might cost some money. They might come and demonstrate. I live in Paris, so in France we had a lot of demonstrations that started at the beginning due to the energy transition.
Yeah, so first to say, we don't create these models. They're coming from modeling groups, that are huge modeling groups, and there are a range of models, and each of them will have different methodologies and assumptions on some specific issues, but basically all of those are what are called in the literature to least cost pathways. So what will be the least cost strategy that you will get to reduce emissions? That leaves out a lot of the work that we were showing on co-benefits, on avoided impacts, and looking. So there are different type of modeling communities and different type of analysis. We have tried to cover parts of what is left outside of those models in terms of benefits and co-benefits. Just to give you examples, avoided fossil fuel imports. There are countries that are largely exposed to changes in commodity prices that end up being percentages of GDP from one year to the other. If you could avoid all of that, so we have covered parts of that. There's obviously a massive task, I guess, for the research community to account for all the costs and benefits, but I will be fairly secure to say that when you look at avoided economic impacts, and on top of that you put co-benefits and you look at market trends, I'm pretty sure that the net cost of this is, if not zero, probably negative.
Great, thanks very much. So I'd like to leave this section of the event here if we can, and instead invite to the stage representatives from 3 governments who will have perspectives on this, I think. First of all, the Honourable Simon Steele, who's Minister of Climate Resilience, Environment, Forestry, Fisheries and Information in the Government of Grenada, and also a member of the Grenadian Senate. Mr. Selwyn Hart, who's Executive Director of the Caribbean constituency of the Inter-American Development Bank, which puts about $13 billion per year into sustainable development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And hot for a meeting just across town, Nick Bridge, who's the UK's special representative for climate change. The UK, of course, having recently a net zero target in law, and almost certain to be the host of the 2020 Climate Summit. I'm going to join you down on the panel. Bill, you're staying with us, which is fantastic. So,
got to keep it under control. Sit next to you to keep it under control.
Best of luck. So, perhaps I can ask you first. You were following events down at the special day on Monday, the Climate Summit on Monday, and you've heard now from climate analytics scientists the scale of the challenge, what needs to be done in order to keep climate change under 1.5. So what would be your reflections on the scale of the challenges presented here and the scale of the responses that you saw on Monday?
I think at the end of the summit, the Secretary General, I think, summed it up extraordinarily well. He was enthused about a lot of the pledges that were made throughout the course of the day. There were many very positive notes, and we're seeing greater traction, a greater appreciation of the need for the scaling up, greater urgency of action. However, he caveated that, and I think this is the real point, that it is still not enough, and we still have a very long way to go. And the presentations earlier, Anne Powell's applied the science to that. When you add up and you quantify the measures that are being taken, however sexy they sound in terms of news headlines, aren't enough to push the needle to where we need to be, which is below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so we know that the science is there. The science is irrefutable. There are those that wish to engage and prolong that scientific discussion for whatever agendas that they have. But the science is very clear. And then, speaking as a small island developing state that's on the front line of this battle against climate change, where we could ignore the science and just observe what we are seeing every single day, whether it's from sea level rise, whether it is extreme floods, hurricanes, the effects of coral bleaching, loss of biodiversity, all of those impacts we're seeing and feeling. Our Prime Minister was due to travel to New York a couple of days earlier than he actually managed to get out here. But we had Tropical Storm Karen pass through, shut down the airport, shut down all businesses. We had extreme flooding events that caused great distress. Trinidad, Tobago affected even worse. We just have to look back at 3 or so weeks ago with Hurricane Dorian and the impact that had on our brothers and sisters in the Bahamas, and the immense damage. Grenada can speak of its own experiences with Hurricane Ivan, where in the matter of 4 hours, 95% of property infrastructure was destroyed or damaged, equivalent to 200% of our GDP. We're feeling this. We know this. This is not an academic discussion. This is not a debating matter. So what we saw coming out of Monday was encouraging. but much more work to do. I think the challenge of the Secretary General, the challenge for all of us, is to see how we can at least get the uplift that we saw, and that positivity, that momentum. It has significant value, although not enough, but how we transpose that into the upcoming COP, and how that is then reflected in the negotiating rooms where the politics, it's the politics, not the science, takes hold, and to see if there is a way in which some of the raised ambition that we are seeing, we are hearing called for, can be reflected in that COP.
But that figure that you gave there, the 200% of GDP, and that perhaps gives some perspective to the question that we heard earlier on economics, doesn't it? Selwyn Hart, you've been in this field a long time, climate change and sustainable development. There's a sort of similar question to you. What are your reflections overall on the scale of the challenge as laid out here and the responses that we heard on Monday?
First of all, I just want to thank you and Bill and the team for inviting me here, and really to congratulate Bill and his team again for really bringing issues related to 1.5 to the top of the global agenda. This was a fight. Leon Charles is sitting over there. Very good friend of mine that we really started as far back as 2008 in Poznan, 2008. And when we first put this long-term goal of holding the increase in temperature to 1.5 on the table, it was under the chairmanship of Grenada. It was a different administration at this time, minister. We were isolated. No one supported us. In fact, I remember some folks from the NGO community came to meet us at a session in Bonn after Poznan, and told us that we should take 1.5 off the table because it was unrealistic. So for me, seeing now that 1.5 has been is the established benchmark for ambition in the global community, or among key parts of the global community, I think is somewhat of a moral victory. And 1.5 must remain the global benchmark for ambition. Anything else really needs to be deemed unacceptable for the small island developing states. So I really welcome in the presentation this focus on upgrading national pledges by 2020. For me, the pathway to 1.5 has to be our area of focus. And and quite frankly, I'm not speaking on behalf of the IDB, but I'm very concerned over this, what I call misguided focus from many in the NGO community and some, friendly governments over this misguided focus on net zero by 2050. And before anyone attacks me, I'll tell you why. Yes, we need to achieve net zero by 2050 or well before 2050, as the science clearly states. But in my view, what I'm seeing is a very cynical attempt and campaign to give the illusion that governments are taking action when they're not. In my view, the political energies need to be focused on increasing near-term ambition. It should be focused on the pathway. It needs to be focused on what a politician, and Minister, you're a politician, and I'm not beating up on politicians. So, but if you tell a politician, I will give you a get out of jail, you can commit to prepare a strategy to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, 30 years from now, when you'll probably be dead, or you will definitely have retired from politics, and you will have to play no part in, you will not have to pay a political cost. I would take it, you know, unless you're a politician from a small island developing state, of course, or a vulnerable country. And this focus on net zero by 2050, the vulnerable countries need to be very careful that they're not used as political props for their own demise. The focus needs to be on near-term ambition. So while we welcome commitments from the UK and Germany and other countries to achieve net zero by 2050, it has to be, shows the money, shows what you will be doing by 2020 to increase your ambition. When are you phasing out coal? Right? Those are the tough questions you folks in this room need to be asking those governments, rather than asking countries to commit to prepare a strategy to achieve net zero by 2050. 30 years from now, what are you going to do next year to increase your ambition level? So I think Secretary General Guterres, DSG, Amina Mohammed must be congratulated for their courage, absolute courage in putting together this climate summit, delivering some very tough messages when the politics, as the minister said, around climate change is at it's at the worst it's been, certainly within the last 10 years. Politics is absolutely horrendous. So they must be congratulated for their courage in putting this issue, continue to place this issue at the top of the global agenda. So I would never criticize them in terms of what the objectives of this exercise, but I really think we need to re-evaluate, you know, our strategy in terms of what we need to be focused on over the course of the next few months and years.
So, and I think there's the perfect segue to, as a representative of a country that did put net zero on the map with the 2050 target in national law earlier this year. Now, you're not a politician, you work for the government. What would you say about, in response to Selwyn's challenge, about what the government might be putting on the table next year in terms of accelerating emission cuts?
Great. Well, I'll say thank you, Richard, thank you, Bill, and for all of you for being here. But thank you, Mr. Selwyn, because it's so good to be in a proper debate about substantive, delicate, difficult. You know, there's been a few platforms this week where people have read out their lines. So no, I totally will take on and welcome that challenge. I'd say a couple of things up front, but then actually I'd like to focus the time on, I think, this sort of question of where to focus attention. Just so to get the facts out of the way, yeah, we've done net zero by 2050, all greenhouse gases, not carbon, and there's an issue there that we need to clarify, because there's a big difference, as Bill knows better than anyone on the planet, by 2050. That's been a big domestic thing, but it's not the only thing. We've got out of coal. To your point about substantive near-term actions, we were 40% coal 7 years ago, zero now. That was just seemed to be not possible a few years ago, but because of hard, difficult regulation work, policy work, and amazing innovation by business, and going to scale on costs, offshore wind's come in. Offshore wind and other renewables were 57% of the mix. Gas was 15% of the mix last week. We would have expected those numbers to be literally the other way around about 3 years ago. So coming out of coal, we've got that experience. Every country's different, but that's been our experience. Internationally, our focus has been on putting ourselves forward for COP, and I'm delighted that we've got the nomination. I think we don't get formal sign-off till Santiago this year in Chile at COP25, and we must put COP25 first. But let me tell you that the system is rapidly gearing up in the UK to make sure COP26 is the stakes just could not be higher. Science, I'm so glad we're at a science is the basis of everything debate, and just to reiterate, that's obviously our view. The IPCC, I was delighted. I was really worried at the beginning of last year that just would not resonate somehow. It was going to be too difficult to nuance and explain the difference between 1.5 and 2, but actually it brilliantly encapsulated the extent of the challenge at 1.5 and the difference with 2. And when you could go around and say the coral's gone above 2 degrees, so that we're not talking about that as being okay. So science behind everything, first point. Second point, I think somebody already said, leaders. You've got to get to leaders. I was seeing Yobi Yin, who I think was being referred to when I came in the room. Just a phenomenal woman in Malaysia who's really turning that. But, I don't think she or many other leaders around the world would mind saying, a lot of this is quite fragile. You know, there's got to be a mainstream leadership from prime ministers and presidents down in every country. And that brings me to my third point, which is we all come to UNCAS. You know, some of us go to the COPs, some of us go to California Summit, and it's all incredibly important. But we've got to mainstream this debate and be at the other big global events. I was really delighted the way Davos did its bit. But I mean, we can all talk about Davos and what you think of it, but it had 5 of its top 7 business risks as climate and environment this year. And it was the front page headline again and again. They tried to do that as their first day headline, and it was the first, second, third day headline. So we've got to mainstream what we're all doing into those core economic and financial and business conversations around the world. So I was really pleased that at the spring meetings this year, we finally had a really serious, high-profile finance ministers group on climate. The work that Mark Carney and others have been doing on through central bank and financial institutional networks on understanding financial risk and disclosing and having that pressure on all companies around the world to disclose is having a real shift. I've just come from a meeting where we have 500 institutional investors around the world with $37 trillion under management demanding that we meet the Paris goals and governments step up. So that's my third point, is just this mainstreaming of this agenda. It's not enough for us to be sitting talking to each other. Fourth, resilience and adaptation. Again, I mean, the thing that got this on the map for the top levels of the UK government, we were, I feel, you know, big climate change leaders for a long time, and it faded a bit. Well, sort of, we're speaking frankly here, but, you know, I think it came back, I think, actually, you know, in a big way. One single event, Hurricane Irma, you know, head of the UNGA, brought back the realization this was the biggest crisis in the region, and we've just had an absolute pounding day after day of extreme weather events that's bringing it home to the political level. So we led on the resilience and adaptation part of UNCAS this year with Egypt, but also with great support from St. Lucia, Bangladesh, Netherlands, Malawi, and some multilateral partners. So resilience and adaptation. Whether we like it or not, we're going to continue to hear about these horrifying and extreme events, and that we've got to harness that to build political will. Fifth, just big actual, I hesitate to sort of say real economy because it makes the UN processes sound unreal, but real economy shifts. You know, if you think about the incredibly difficult geopolitics that we all know about, in terms of can we get all the world's leaders and the biggest emitters to the table and ambitious, we all know just how challenging that is looking. We have to look to what we do have, which was an extraordinary shift in the economics of this agenda. So I've talked a bit about how, you know, society is much more aware, the environmental impacts are clear, but the economics are all heading in one direction. That we're already there with renewables. We have to get there much faster with transport, with decarbonising industry, with decarbonising infrastructure. And that's perhaps where I come back to sort of a bit challenge, or I would give my own interpretation of view on what you said, Selwyn. Net zero, you know, just let's be careful before we trash net zero and focus on near-term actions. You absolutely need both. And I'll tell you the UK's experience, which is that net zero is statutory legislation. So you might argue whether it's 2050 or 2055 or 2030 or 2040, but it's statutory legislation that has 5-year carbon budgets the government must meet. So we have to act today at a sprint, right now today, with our clean growth plan to deliver pathways across our economy to keep us on track for 2050. The problem is that many countries might talk about net zero, I think maybe your point, might talk about net zero and then not do anything about it or not have concrete binding plans. So a big push for us is that if you actually legislate or have other ways of having national plans that are binding, the net zero can be a really, really important tool for sending out a political message that we are delivering on the Paris commitment to decarbonise, and here's how we're going to do it. And our government is already under pressure from our independent climate change committee and our legislation, our statutory duty, to do really, really tough things in all sectors of the economy. And we're actually off track. We're delivering against carbon budgets 1, 2, and 3 in the UK. We're really off track on 4 and 5, which is in about 10 years' time. The beauty of having that long-term framework and that binding legislation is that we've got that period now to actually, act on all the things we need to do. So we did a Powering Past Coal global alliance, and we moved out of coal faster. We've ramped up our sector deals, and offshore wind for us now, it's way over half the price in 18 months because we've gone to scale. The economic story behind, just to give one example on offshore, the first turbines took about 3 months to put in the ground. The most recent turbines went into the North Sea in 12 hours. So if you want like 100 times productivity gain, jobs in all these depressed parts of our economies, skills, new industries, all the clean, green, exciting stuff, and the just transition, and sort of that positive story of jobs and prosperity. It's all there. We've got to frame it. So my ask, in a sense, to colleagues and to you in the room is to help us as we look to COP, which is 50 weeks away or something absolutely terrifying, to really put everything into COP25 with Chile. A great focus there on oceans and other areas. There's a lot of hard work to do in the negotiating room in COP25 and in COP26. But we've got to bring the momentum that's building up on the streets and that's out there in the business community and in civil society and roll it into what success looks like for COP26.
Bill, perhaps one quick thought from you before we go to questions. Your work has basically shown that to keep 1.5 in play, across the board, you need a 50% increase in NDC ambitions, and that's really got to be delivered by the end of next year. So, especially bearing in mind, perhaps you've got a representative of the government that's going to be the COP host here. How can that be done? How politically can that be done?
It's a good question. In fact, it's a fundamental question given the relatively disappointing announcements this week, and I think that gets down to what is a classic issue, is who are going to be the leaders politically that will get ambition on the agenda at COP25 and who will carry that ambition momentum into next year and find opportunities during 2020, regular opportunities to put governments under pressure. Historically, it has been leaders who have moved this climate issue forward. I remember one famous UK Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who has mixed reviews in some quarters, but on the climate change issue was at the forefront of initiating what became the Climate Convention. At other moments in history, other leaders have stepped up to move this forward, and we're at a moment in history now where it's very clear that we need leaders, we need governments, not just one but several, who are prepared to step up and try and lead the rest of the global community to a higher level of ambition. And that means, I think, in the first instance, making sure that ambition is front and centre of what is to be done in COP25 in Santiago in just a relatively few weeks.
Excellent. Now let's take a few questions and comments. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if there's anything you want to say or you want to ask, this is absolutely your chance. Yes, in the middle here, please. No, yeah, go on, you go.
I just curious about something. Thank you for the presentation and your share by politics science side. When we come to the net zero, or we decrease the greenhouse gas, and then temperature will decrease, right? And after that, do you think about the other factor about the ozone and for the undeveloped or developing country, and the factor is will relative with the effect of this situation like that?
Do you mean the sort of total benefits for developing countries of achieving emission cuts? Is that the focus of the question? Perhaps one for you, Bill. You've done a bit of work on avoided impacts, just in a nutshell. the sort of benefits of keeping stuff to 1.5?
Look, I think the scientific community really pulled that together in the 1.5 degree special report and showed the very substantial sustainable development benefits particularly for the most vulnerable and developing countries. So I think that's really clear. And it's a very strong message that policymakers and politicians can use to justify a lot of action.
Just to put this into a stark context, achieving 1.5 is still half a degree more than where we are today. And when we see the havoc that is being wreaked, certainly in the Caribbean region, and this new normal that we're dealing with, it's actually quite scary. What that means is we're asking the world that some say is the impossible, certainly extraordinarily ambitious, but even if we achieve that, the Secretary General called it what? It isn't a Category 5 hurricane, it's a Category Hell. A Category Hell. It's apocalyptic, what we face as these hurricanes pass through us. Achieving 1.5, it gets worse. And that is what we have to live with for generations to come. This is scary stuff. And the point that was raised about the importance of adaptation, as a small island developing state, mitigation is critical, absolutely critical in terms of containing the crisis, just containing the crisis, absolutely critical. But what's of significant importance to us, not today, yesterday, is the need to adapt to this new normal and adapt quickly. And the scaling up of ambition, the scaling up of resources to enable us to deal with these apocalyptic conditions.
Great, thank you. Jump in 2 rows back there with the
Oras Tynkkynen, Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. I come from a country, Finland, that has set a climate neutrality target by 2035. But I would actually like to defend the UK for setting the 2050 target for 2 reasons. One is that setting a long-term target is a politically feasible way to make ambition happen in the short and medium term. Because if you look at the numbers, it means that you have to raise your ambition by 2030 in most cases. And the second reason why I think setting a target even as far in the future as 2050 is good is that I'm pretty sure that if you set your eyes on this goal, you're actually going to achieve that earlier than 2050, because that is going to trigger transformational change. So kudos to the UK, and let's hope that the other countries are going to follow.
Would you have a quick reaction to that?
I hear you, but the reality is countries like the UK are the outliers. You know, in the 1970s, developed countries promised committed to provide 0.7% of their official development assistance to developing countries in the 1970s. And it was not until, if I remember, in the early 2000s that a handful of the smaller European countries actually fulfilled that commitment. So from the perspective of developing countries, we're really scared of 30-year plus these multi-decade promissory notes. So while the UK and countries like Finland, you are the good guys. You have your short-term plans to back up these long-term objectives. Not all countries are. And I think the focus of your energy, of mobilization, should not be on to get as many countries as possible to commit to a 30-year goal, when it is to get leaders who can make the difference now to commit to ramping up ambition. That needs to be the absolute focus. I just want to touch on the resilience point, because it's also a valid point in terms of how the development system is, or an architecture is orienting itself to this new normal. And this new normal, I'm seeing in the Atlantic Basin, the very first time, 4 consecutive years of Category 5 hurricanes. Right? It's never happened before in recorded history. It also coincides with the 5 warmest years of that we've ever had. And we have a development system that is not adapted to this new normal. So we've seen the devastation in the Bahamas, where hundreds are still missing, billions of dollars in damage. But the Bahamas has been graduated from receiving development assistance to help it with the enormous task of rebuilding lives and livelihoods. The development system, the entire development, needs to reorient itself to this new normal. We're a countries like ours, who are small countries, you're faced with this existential threat of climate change, can find ways to build resilience, not only build back better, but build back in a way that allows us to address some of these new norms. Unfortunately, the development system does not pivot fast enough. And all it takes is a stroke of the pen. You know, I'm not going to put the UK under pressure because they're good friends to the Caribbean. All it takes is a stroke of a pen for us to address what development planners never foresaw decades and decades ago.
Just super quick. No, and I totally respect all the points. It's just good to flush this out. I think you're absolutely right about the risk of setting a target that doesn't mean anything. So it's both. It's both. And the thing, just to pick up Bill and Simon's, the thing that really stunned me was the chart that shows the carbon envelope for the world that keeps you at 1.5 or even indeed at 2. It's filled by current and under construction fossil fuel. Did you cover that earlier? Yeah, before I got here. That's the scale of it. It's not just about stopping coal and about stopping fossil fuel. It's going to be about taking it out. So couldn't agree more with the scale of that challenge. The final quick thing that triggered from resilience and adaptation, sorry, more questions. Do you want to just reinforce, I think it's been incredibly powerful and long overdue, the way that biodiversity and ecosystems and climate and development have come into the same conversation. We've got a long way to go, but it has risked being some separate conversations. You cannot get the political buy-in that you need unless you build all of those arguments, and they're all mutually reinforcing, and they're all ultimately about the same thing. And we have the COP15 next year with China, which is the biodiversity COP. We have the SDGs review next year. So to my earlier point about using all avenues, let's just not talk about climate and an NDC and a negotiation. This is a wider thing.
We are technically out of time, but can we carry on a few more minutes? It's not that no one's going out of the room or something like this. Okay.
I just wanted to, could I just jump on?
Just very quickly, I do want to take some more questions.
Okay, it was the point that Salim was making about ODA eligibility and graduation. I met yesterday with the OECD, and consideration is being given to reviewing eligibility criteria based on environmental practices, so to disincentivize, which is brilliant, very, very good. But took advantage of the opportunity. If they are looking to review eligibility criteria based on environmental practice, what about based on vulnerability? And this is a major issue for small island developing states that are graduating to middle income status, disqualifying them from ODA support. And you look at the Bahamas right now and the point that Salim was making. So if we have the courage to review it based on environmental practice, and there is general consensus that's what we should be doing, we also need to be looking at that vulnerability index to take into account these extreme conditions and extraordinary conditions that we face.
Great, thank you. Another question?
Yeah, I'll try to be as succinct as I possibly can. Obviously, it's clear that there's this major gap, and everyone needs to be all hands on deck. What I haven't really heard is, or kind of the elephant in the room is, in the United States, we've had to get down to state level and corporate level and individual level declarations or commitments. And so my question is ultimately, is there any part of this conversation where there can be compartmentalized pieces of action that can be disseminated or encouraged or broken down to the point where a sub-state or a company or a municipality can begin to plug into these things so that it's not just on the top of the legislative food chain, and it's actually something that can begin to filter through the fabric of society. And
that's an interesting point. I mean, presumably, just on a technical basis, Bill, you could take what you've done for countries and you could break that down to regions or cities, I presume.
Well, yeah, actually, that's a very interesting and active discussion. The C40 are asking us to look at this actual issue itself, of breaking it down, and it can be broken down at corporation level or at even regions within countries to look at what needs to happen. For the United States, I think it's really interesting that every time the Climate Action Tracker has a look at the elephant you referred to, that we see the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle climate and energy action are not yet having a big effect. And that's because a lot of states are moving forward with clean energy targets, electric vehicle incentives. The cost of renewable energy is dropping, coal and increasingly natural gas in the power sector is being edged out by renewable energy and new storage technologies. And that's driven by markets, but it's also driven by a growing awareness and preference and political decisions under the radar, even in places like Texas. So I think the story there is that subnational level action can indeed move things forward unless and until federal action in federated states actually comes around. We do see limits to that in some places. I know in Australia we're seeing the limits to market potential where a government hostile to renewables is stepping in and intervening actively in the power market that will limit that uptake. So it's not a panacea or a solution, but it's definitely a way of keeping things moving forward and should be motivation to anyone in their city, their state, to really agitate for action because it will overflow, spill over and have a positive benefit everywhere else.
I hear Nancy Pelosi's got it under control anyway, hasn't she now? Any more questions, comments? Yes, gentleman right here, please.
Lawrence Moss, New York City Bar Association. So to focus on a couple of key takeaways I got from today's session, one of the most adverse developments of the new coal plants being built in South and Southeast Asia, bad news. Good news, renewables actually have a cost advantage now over such plants. So then how to explain and how can we deal with Japan continuing to finance these plants or a state like Bangladesh, which will have some of the most adverse effects from climate change, basing their energy policy on coal? You know, these juxtapositions don't make sense. And how do you address Japan? How do you address Bangladesh and other countries in the region, which seem to be, these juxtapositions don't make sense?
Well, they make sense at the moment because Japan is not the only financer. China and Korea are the financiers, and so there's a competition there for business here now today. So you have to raise a political cost and an economic cost for continuing. And I think the mood is shifting, but we've got to accelerate the shift. So it will happen, but will it happen fast enough? And, China was doing a lot more coal domestically. It really slowed that down.